The transformation of the U.S. shale patch over the past 2 decades, in which it has emerged as one of the world's most important oil fields, has been mirrored in Alberta. But there, it's an ownership shift. Of course, we're talking about oil assets that are 3,000 kilometres apart, very different economics. Both places, though, seeing consolidation among producers, in particular, Canadian Natural's acquisition of Chevron's oil sands assets. So there's been this 7-year transfer of power that leaves control of these Alberta assets almost entirely in the hands of companies based in Canada. Let's get more from BloombergNEF's Danny Adkins. Danny, thanks very much indeed for joining us. And it sure has been a massive process, hasn't it? Global oil companies pulling out of the oil sands.
Yes, for sure, and thanks for having me. So actually the mirroring of U.S. shale and the oil sands, it really began probably at around the turn of the century, where both regions saw massive explosions in production just about the same time, where in the oil sands we saw about a tripling of oil production over the last 20 years. And then over the last 7 years or so, we've seen consolidation across both industries. And that has been most recently capped off with Chevron's sale of their oil sands assets just last week or the week before to Canadian Natural Resources.
Why are these global oil companies pulling out? I mean, I know some of them have said we want to reduce our overall carbon emissions, but are there other reasons?
Yeah, so I think there's actually a couple of reasons why we're seeing this happen. So I guess let me back up a bit. So we saw oil sands production associated with these big oil producers. We saw that increase about double from 2010 to 2016 to account for about 35% of oil sands production. But with this most recent sale, that's down to about 17%. And actually, if you exclude Exxon's investment in Imperial Oil, that's only 5%. And so there's a couple reasons why they've been doing this. I think the first of which is tied to the large amount of carbon emissions that are associated with oil sands extraction. And that's both because these companies would like to see the emissions intensity of their oil production across their entire portfolio be reduced. Mm-hmm. But I think potentially more so is the fact that the ongoing legal battle and regulatory environment that these companies are facing with the announced emissions cap on the oil sands industry or the Canadian oil industry, it certainly adds a lot more risk to holding on to these assets. And this is part of a broader trend that we're seeing with these companies that they're selling their non-core assets to focus on a handful of basins or regions. Mm-hmm.
It's interesting, this emissions cap that the government has proposed, it is encountering pushback from the oil industry, who have warned that it is, in fact, a clamp, a limit on oil production. But you think that's a factor that's discouraging global oil from being in the oil sands?
Yeah, I think it certainly is. It at least adds another factor of risk for these companies to continue their operations there, because they're inevitably, so while it's not a cap on actual production, it certainly will limit the potential growth in the industry. And so this adds sort of just an unnecessary headache for a lot of these major international oil companies to deal with these upcoming legal battles and CCUS, carbon capture investments that will be required to meet these emissions cap standards. So it simply, even if it won't cap production, it adds just sort of a legal and regulatory headache for some of these companies.
And just very quickly, you touched on this, I think. Investors generally these days seem to prefer companies that are focused on a particular basin. They feel it's easier to get their head around the economics.
Yeah, for sure. So we saw this mainly begin, and so actually again with the mirroring between the oil sands and the shale patch, we saw this really begin in the shale patch, probably starting around 2019, where a lot of the mergers and acquisitions that we saw were heavily encouraged to be to focus a company's production profile on a single basin, whether it be the Permian or the Bakken. And so we've seen that also happen with the international oil companies, but they can still have their fingers sort of everywhere compared to some of these independents in the US and in Canada.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you for
great
having me.
story there.